Hi, in this video, we're going to discuss researching court rules, including rules of professional responsibility, and also sources to find the primary law for rules of Massachusetts evidence. The first thing that we're going to talk about is court rules, and I have a quick video demonstration. This example's from the movie Legally Blonde. If you haven't seen it, it involves a young woman played by Reese Witherspoon who ends up going to Harvard Law School, and she is taking part in a murder trial where she's working as a student along with a whole cadre of other students under the supervision of a professor. The woman that she's representing turns out to be a woman who went to the same sorority as she went to for undergraduate. And the professor, who doesn't believe the woman's alibi, doesn't believe the woman's story, ends up getting fired from the case, and Elle Woods, who's a student, ends up taking over. So let's watch this clip, and you'll see how she talks to the judge about the court rule that lets her take over this case or represent the woman in this case.
You're in my way.
She's a law student. She can't defend you.
Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court ruling 3.03.
See? Thank you, David.
Counselors, approach the bench.
You're not going up there.
Oh, yes, I am. I'm sorry, maybe you didn't hear me. You were fired.
Counselors, now, all of you.
Elle Woods, Your Honor. Rule 3.03 of Supreme Judicial Court states that a law student may appear on behalf of a defendant in criminal proceedings.
Your Honor, I have no problem with this.
I do. I'm not allowing it.
Oh, but you agreed last night in your office when we were discussing my career.
The ruling also states that you need a licensed attorney to supervise you. Mr. Callahan.
That I won't agree to.
I'll supervise, Your Honor.
So this is just one example of how court rules might come into play in a case, sort of a fun one from a movie. But let's look at the types of court rules that you might be asked to research. Well, in Massachusetts, there's some general rules that apply to more than one court, namely the rules of civil procedure, criminal procedure, and appellate procedure. And then there are rules, standing orders, and general practices of particular courts. Let's just take a quick look at this webpage. On this webpage, you can see that here are those general rules I was talking about, and then it lists all of the different courts that have individual rules, for example, the Supreme Judicial Court, the Mass Trial Court. Here you can see the Mass Superior Court rules in addition to rules. They have specific rules governing particular procedures. They have standing orders and guidelines. All of these things might be something you would be asked to research as a young associate for a case. Okay, so if you've done any rules practice before, you probably know the types of questions that you might be looking at when you're looking for rules to answer something for your supervising attorney or something that has to do with your case, but I did want to give you a few examples. Things like how would you summon a witness, when can you join claims, fees, deadlines, even things like the type of margins that you have to have on your document and page limits could be included in court rules. And these are the sources for court rules in Massachusetts, and we'll look at these when we go on to our other videos on Lexis, Westlaw, and free sources. This will be similar to the process that we did for statutes. It's a different type of source, but the research process is similar. So in annotated statutes, or if you're looking in print in Lexis, there's accompanying volumes, not actually included in the statute, but would be located with the statute. And these have annotations to the court rules. So that's on Westlaw and Lexis or their print counterpart. For unannotated versions, which means just the rules themselves and the notes, the notes of the commentators, the commentary that follows, I should say, the rules, you can look at the court website that I showed you and click on those clickable links to the court rules. Another source that has the text of the court rules along with annotations are some of the mass practice volumes. There's one that has to do specifically with rule practice in 2 volumes. There's a civil practice one, there's appellate practice. I just gave you a couple of examples here. In terms of finding beyond the bare text of the rule or the commentary, so you need to know case law interpretation of a particular rule. And also I wanted to give you some information about updating. So as I mentioned, there are annotated versions of the rules, and there are secondary sources which can help you with the case law interpretation. For updating, we can look at citators for rules. We have Keysight and Shepard's. If we don't have access to those, we can create our own citator like we have in the past in free or low-cost sources. In addition to using the Shepard's or Keysight, because the amendments to the court rules don't come out on Keysight and Shepard's very quickly for the state court rules, you could also look to the court website where they post proposed amendments to the rules as well as the finalized amendments. And also the publication Mass Lawyers Weekly has the same information. It has the proposed rules as well as new court rules that have been amended or amendments to court rules. Okay, so that was a little bit about the court rules in Massachusetts. One particular set of court rules in Massachusetts are the rules of professional conduct. And they're adopted by the SJC, and all of the rules of professional conduct are contained in Rule 307. So when you're looking on any of these court rule sites, to find the rules of professional conduct, usually you're going to have to go into Rule 307. Some of the sources have it as a separate source titled Rules of Professional Conduct, but it's actually Rule 307 of the SJC court rules. So some common issues if you've taken, I'm sure you've all taken at this point, professional responsibility, but some of the same issues are rules in Massachusetts, as you know from the reading, are based on the model ABA rules, so they're going to be the same types of issues, conflicts of interest, what is the scope of the representation you have to give to a client, who has the right to practice in Massachusetts, all of those types of issues. In terms of the sources, as I said, the rules of professional conduct are a type of court rule, so they're going to be the same as we just looked at for other court rules. In terms of case interpretations and updating, again, it's going to be mostly similar to what we talked about for court rules. You're going to be able to look at, in terms of interpretation, for case law citators, there's going to be secondary sources that could be helpful. For this particular type of rule, the one that I'm recommending, there are others, but there's a good one, Ethical Lawyering in Massachusetts, an MCLE treatise, and the annotated version of the rules on Lexis or Westlaw or their print counterparts. The one thing that you have with the rules of professional conduct that we didn't see with the court rules are we have something called ethics opinions, which are given out by the Bar Association in a particular state. In Massachusetts, we see them from the Massachusetts Bar Association and the Boston Bar Association, and they give interpretations of the rules based on a query from a practicing attorney that say, this is how we interpret the rule. In Massachusetts, these ethics opinions are not binding, but it gives you some indication of how a particular rule might be interpreted. I also listed here the ABA formal and informal opinions. Again, this is a source that wouldn't be binding authority, but because our Massachusetts rules of professional conduct are based on the ABA model rules, those opinions, which are interpreting a rule that's similar to the rule that we have in Massachusetts, because ours is based on it, could be a helpful source to look at to get an idea of how the rule might be interpreted. Again, not binding. Okay, in terms of amendment, it's going to be the same as the other court rules. We can look at the court website, and we can also look in Mass Lawyers Weekly to find out if there's been any proposed amendments or amendments that have gone through or been finalized, or any new rules that we might need to be aware of. Okay, the next thing I want to discuss for this class is giving some background information about evidence. And I have another example for us here. This one comes from the movie My Cousin Vinny, which if you haven't seen it, it's kind of an old movie, but it's really funny. In the movie, there are two young men, one of which has a cousin Vinny, thus the title, who are arrested in, I forget where, some state in the South. I think it's Alabama. They're arrested and it ends up, they had a broken taillight, but it ends up looking like they might be suspects in a murder case because what we find out in the end is they have a car that looks very similar to the people who did the murder. So in this scene, sorry, I missed a part. And one of the young men has a cousin Vinny who's just graduated from law school, and he goes down and he ends up representing these men in this case. And in this scene, he's trying to get his girlfriend, who worked in her father's garage, to be allowed to be an expert witness in the case. So this is an evidentiary issue. I'm going to show you the clip now. Hold on one sec.
What you do in your father's garage?
Tune-ups, oil changes, brake relining, engine rebuilds, rebuild some trannies, rear-end.
Okay. But does being an ex-mechanic necessarily qualify you as being an expert on tire marks?
No. Thank you. Goodbye.
Sit down and stay there until you're told to leave.
Your Honor, Ms. Vito's expertise is in general automotive knowledge. It is in this area that her testimony will be applicable. Now, if Mr. Trotter wishes to voir dire a witness as to the extent of her expertise in this area, I'm sure he's going to be more than satisfied.
Okay. All right. Now, Ms. Vito, being an expert on general automotive knowledge, can you tell me what would the correct ignition timing be on a 1955 Bel Air Chevrolet with a 327 cubic inch engine and a 4-barrel carburetor?
It's a bullshit question.
Does that mean that you can't answer it?
It's a bullshit question. It's impossible to answer.
Impossible because you don't know the answer.
Nobody can answer that question.
Your Honor, I move to disqualify Ms. Vito as an expert witness.
Can you answer the question?
No, it is a trick question.
Why is it a trick question?
Watch this.
The Chevy didn't make a 327 in 55. The 327 didn't come out till 62. And it wasn't offered in the Bel Air with the 4-barrel carb till 64. However, in 1964, the correct ignition timing would be 4 degrees before top dead center.
Well, she's acceptable, Your Honor.
Okay, so that just gave us one example of trying to get someone verified as an expert witness at trial. And there are lots of different types of evidentiary issues. This one just happened to come from a really funny movie. In Massachusetts, as you probably know if you've taken evidence or from the reading, we haven't adopted a set of rules as that we have in other states or at the federal level. Rather, our rules of evidence come from the common law. So we have a collection of rules that are applicable in evidentiary issues in Massachusetts, and those rules actually could stem from Constitution, the Massachusetts general laws, the common law, rules of court, all different places that we have rules that are applicable to evidentiary issues. So no one set place that we can look to find what the rule might be about a particular issue. So what we need to do to find the primary law that governs an evidentiary issue in Massachusetts is to look to the secondary sources. That's the best way to find the rules. And I've listed a number of different ones here. Probably the primary one, I mean, people look to all of these sources, but the primary one that we're going to talk about is the Massachusetts Guide to Evidence, which is put together, and it's mentioned in your reading. Every year there's a new edition, but it's the Guide to Evidence put together by the SJC. Okay, so that's just some background on what we'll be covering. There's more detail in the reading, and we're going to have a video on these types of sources on Lexis Westlaw, and then I want to mention just a few resources on another video, free sources, talk briefly about BNA Bloomberg Law and the updating that you could do on the Mass Lawyers Weekly site.